This is GenXRants. I'm your host, David, once again, and I'm here. Today is Monday, so we're going to talk about politics. And I know that is a divisive thing, but it is what I decided to do on Mondays because politics affects everything. It affects the way you make income, it affects your laws, it affects your church, it affects your schools, it affects everything in a country. Politics. Whether you want to run away from it or not, you cannot escape it. Politics exists in every single country now, whether that is under a democratic system or under a dictatorial system. Well, that depends on where you live. But I live in Canada, so I get a little bit of both, it feels like. However, we are technically a democracy. And just to be clear, Canada is not like the United States. We are a multi party system. We don't have just two, we have quite a multiple of them. And that can cause a few issues when it comes down to it. And it's good to understand where Canada is basically on the spectrum of, hey, is it more of a left leaning country or is it more of a right leaning country? And I got news for you. It is a very left leaning country, especially over the last 22 years. And we'll get into that. Now, why? What does that really mean? So we have a parliamentary system. Basically, they split chunks of our country up. Now, it's not very even or fair in many cases, but it does prevent minority from dictating to majority. And in the same breath, it allows the majority to dictate to the minority. And that can have its pros and cons depending on your thought processes behind it. We also have what is called the lower parliament in Canada and also the upper parliament in Canada. The lower one is the one that we vote for. The upper is something a little newer. It kind of existed, but it's basically senates and senators are elected by the government in power, usually the prime minister himself. That is a pointless, useless thing, but everything does have to technically go for the upper house, which is the Senate, in order like for a bill to be passed into law. That's just Cole's notes. I love to say that. Cole's notes for all you old Gen Xers that understand what I'm talking about. You millennials won't have a clue. Let's just call it the Wikipedia. And for the Gen Zs, we'll call it the shorts. For the Gen As, it'll be like words hurt my head. Just kidding, Gen Alphas. So basically, we only vote for the government federally on a level based on population. They split those things out. There is currently quite a few seats and members of parliament. I would say there's way too many for a population of only 40 million people. It's actually pretty ridiculous. We're probably on par with the United States when it comes to parliamentary people. So we have 343. A lot of that is based on population again. So the higher the population, the more they're going to have voting power, or at least have a division. So it can have a very tight. Let's say you have a city of 5 million people, but there's more here and less there. So you're going to get a population split, voting split, basically based on that. Now, it's much more complicated than that. It depends on the government in power and what they decide to set. And we do not have a president. We don't vote in a president. We vote in a majority, hopefully, or a minority government. And whoever has the highest amount of seats technically is called the majority. Not really. They can be a minority, but they will therefore have their leader be the prime minister of our country. Now, that means, of course, you can already guess, but how do you do anything if you're a minority? You don't. You have to basically every bill or every that you present and you try to pass into law, you must have approval in some way, shape, or form of the lower house, aka all of the parliament members. And if you can't get a majority, basically the bill will fail and nothing gets done. So the only time you can trigger an election, theoretically, there are some other minor ways to do it. We won't get into that. The only way to trigger an election, which is much different, I believe, than the US, I don't believe you can trigger elections based on budgets or financial things. But in Canada, which is similar to the United Kingdom, I believe, is that if, let's say, the government prevents a budget and it is unable to pass, theoretically, the House could call, the members could call for an election based on no confidence in the current government. So it's important to do a lot of kissing babies, making deals, whatever you can do to pass that parliamentary budget. Now, other items are not called. They don't normally trigger an election. So you'll find that Canada can loop into elections quite quickly. I think historically, like the fastest one was some crazy amount, like under 6 months from one government, and then they held an election. And it actually wasn't advantageous to the people that did it, the minority that tried to trigger that, yeah, the minority government that tried to trigger that election ended up basically creating a majority by accident because it surged the popularity. I believe it was conservatives at the time. So it can have its ups and downs, but you can also, when push comes to shove, you can have the government fall if the people aren't happy. Now, the prime minister holds a lot of power, though. He holds sway. He decides who is going to be basically a backbencher and who is going to have a file or be in charge of uh, one of their positions, basically, like finance minister or one of the minister positions. So the more important, higher paying positions. That's all based on the prime minister. Um, the minority government, or what they call it, is the opposition. The opposition is anyone that is has lesser seats than the majority, right? So theoretically, you could have enough power within the minority to create a government, a coalition, as they might call it. And basically, you'll cede power, and then your leader, you would decide on a leader as a coalition, and that person would become prime minister. That's a way to shift governments during minorities. Canada tends to have a lot of minority governments due to the fact, not always, but due to the fact that we have non, like we have I think 4 or 5 different basically parties that at least have status. So let's go through those parties, and this will get a little bit. And this is going to be like a Cole's Notes, just so you understand where I'm coming from as a Canadian. If it's different than the system you're familiar, if you're a Canadian, you'll understand right away what I'm talking about, hopefully, or you'll learn something new today. So, what are the current basically parties that have held seats in the last 3 elections? We have the Conservatives. Conservatives have not held a majority government or been in power since 2014. 2015 was the last election. They lost by quite a bit, and the Liberals did take power. However, the Liberals did not hold a majority. That is because they had been decimated pretty much. However, they had enough seats and they made an agreement with the next party called the NDP. So the NDP are the uh, New Democratic Party. I don't know why they call them Democrats. To me, objectively, they are quite far left. So they are socialists, and they probably will admit they're socialists. They love social programs, they love unions, they love not doing a budget without billions of dollars of debt. They were actually the minority party before the Liberals the last election because the Liberals got basically wiped out almost off the map because of poor decision making. Justin Trudeau, anyone will know that name, became our prime minister at the time. He made a deal with the leader of the NDP to hold power. And basically, the next party, which probably holds more power than the NDP in many cases, is the Bloc, which is a Quebec only separatist party. They do not run in any other ridings in any part of Canada but Quebec. Many people get upset by that and say that if in order to um, be an eligible party, regardless that we have two national languages, the Bloc is a separatist party. So there should be a condition at least where the Bloc should be running members in at least some number of other seats in the country in order to be eligible to run for an election. And I personally agree with that. I think if you don't have enough say in a Canadian federal election, right? That if you don't have a big enough party to run at least most of at least above a middle ground, right? So out of the 343 seats, if you ridings, you should be at least be running somebody in more than half of that. Let's say 60% or 65% of all. At least have somebody there and actually representing the party. That way, the Bloc would be most likely in a lot of trouble. And funny enough, I'm not a fan of the Bloc Québécois because They don't care about anything else but Quebec. They do not tend to say Canadian. They send Quebecers. If you watch Parliament at all, that's the lingo they always use. They don't like to speak in English. They prefer to speak in French. And it has caused quite a division in Canada, I think. I'm not against Quebec itself. I think probably a lot of the people are nice there. I've known some very friendly Quebecers, but at the end of the day, I don't like the party system federally. Now, provincially, you do whatever you want. They've come close to separating from Canada on 3 different occasions, one very close, within 0.5%, and I kind of wish they had, but that's a different story. Next in line, so we've gone over the Liberals, the NDP. So Liberals used to be, just to be clear, who's in power right now, Liberals used to be very center, slightly left. So you have the NDP, right, which was very left. These guys were more reasonable, budget minded, little less social. They were more middle ground, what you would expect. Some social programs, but not a ridiculous amount. Churches, they would leave alone at most of the time. Religious organizations, they'd be hands off and support them. Little bit kind of woke, but not crazy woke. That was 20 years ago. Now they have gone and swung far past the NDP. That's why, and we'll get to that the last election. So you've got Liberals, NDP, Bloc or Quebec Party. Next, but the littlest party of all, with only one seat now, you have our good friend May, who's part of the Green Party. Now, only because they get voted in based on one riding in the British Columbia, in the Victoria area, I believe, every single year for like as long as I remember, they've won at least one seat. Don't have official status. You need at least 12 seats to have official status, meaning that the government or we will pay for your party's existence. So NDP right now do not have official status. Bloc does, but they lost a lot of seats. Green does not. That means they can only survive with donations and support from the people that voted for them. Next, oh, we do have independents. So there can be one or two independents. A lot of that time that happens normally, not always, when somebody is part of a party and decides to dissolve their affiliation with the party they are. They can cross the aisle, as it said, and join a different party, but it tends not to happen that way. It tends they go independent. So they are independents. Last and not least, the official opposition right now is the Conservative Party. Conservative parties are center right. They are not far right in any way, shape, or form. That is never what they've been. That would be more. I don't think we've ever had a far right party in Canada ever. Uh, Canadians have never really thought that way. We've been more center right for most of our history, or slightly center left. So basically in the center. That all changed back in 2015 when Justin Trudeau got in power. Now, in order to revive the Liberal Party, they had to go extreme, 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 extreme. So they had a lot of rhetoric out of their mouths that was basically very reminiscent of socialism. They embarrassed the NDP. They basically outdid the NDP for social programs. Didn't budget. The famous saying from our prime minister was, "The budget will balance itself," which is ridiculous. I worked at the financial industry, and if you said that when you were doing anything, you would be fired immediately. So um, that's kind of where it went, but not just with I think finances, what it and budget. What it really was a social change. And that's kind of what I've talked about in my previous video about and maybe in one of my shorts if you've seen it, about how the thinking of Canada, and this is taking, we won't include the spiritual stuff, but just the way of thinking of Canadians from kind of conservative, nuclear families, men and women, et cetera, all those base things that used to be very normal have been tossed in the garbage or demonized. And we've got this, what culture is really called is a woke. So we have a dynamically woke government um, about everybody's rights and freedoms and, what they identify as, 2 plus 2 can be 5. It's okay to believe those kind of things. And that's at a government level. So and where did that all come from? personally, and the studies have begun to show that that was indoctrinated into the university and high school systems in Canada. And it's been doing that for probably about 30 years because when I was growing up being a Gen Xer, and we rock, being a Gen Xer, I never heard any of this stuff when I was a kid. We were taught about uh, basically being objective thinkers or being critical thinkers, right? So, critical thinking is not believing everything at face value, really pulling it apart, analyzing it. How does the past, what is the present, and how does this affect the future, right? So, have we learned? Where are we at and where are we going? And being able to objectively analyze these things is kind of what I grew up understanding. But that sort of has began to change in the school system, especially with millennials. And I've noticed that a lot of millennials were entitled, my rights, give me this. And I'm not trying to generalize all millennials, but that seemed to be a pattern. Because in the workplace, I noticed it in the social and in the political realms, it began to take shape. Where social justice, the environment, um, whatever. It was always a cause. And now getting back, taking my values are old values. Those are out of date values. The boomer values are out of date. You're all just a bunch of capitalist people that don't care, and which isn't true. I think a lot of Gen Xers, we are the ones that established, uh, caring and social programs and stuff. Because, like I said, I've always said I'm a center right. I believe there is a time and a place to help people out, give them a hand. I because I recognize not everybody is on the same financial standing. I also believe that you shouldn't be taxing your rich people to death because they create the jobs. Now, do I think that rich people should take all their money and hide it in a shelter and not be taxed at all? No, not at all. Do I think they should take all their uh, factories like they have over the last 30 years and ship them across seas to save on um, labor? No, but that's a balancing act of, well, what has your labor laws caused that make it uneconomical for a company to stay here? Or what are the uh, once again, government, what are the taxes? And is there any sort of benefits for keeping something in Canada? So, what it's been really done is these politics have gotten off of being productive and gotten on off, give me something, which is again entitlement. What social programs can, what these poor children, feed the children. Like it's no longer a parent's responsibility to feed their children, or maybe they can't afford it because the economy's so bad due to the government that, take inflation. I think if you're living in the United States or Canada, inflation, and I'm not exaggerating, whatever numbers are out there are lies. Real world numbers, you look at bread and eggs and your staples, and you really say, how much was it even 5 years ago and how much is now? There's your true inflation. How much is housing was and how much is it now? That's inflation. So government affects all of this. Canadian government has been terrible on a financial, excuse me, and on a social standing for the last 15 years, since 2015. Well, 10 years. We're going on 11 now. The government is the responsibility of the people voting it in. So no matter what I think at the end of the day of, well, the liberals are bad, they call us this, really it comes down to where are Canadian people in their decision making and who are the Canadians that are voting these people in. I think, and I've lived out east for about 24 years so of my life, maybe 23. So I know the thinking of Ontario and the east. I've lived now 26 years, going on 26 years now in the west. So I've got a good understanding of Canada in how it thinks economically, spiritually, socially, and politically on both sides of the spectrum. And I'll tell you this, the East and the West think quite a bit different. It's like Republicans and conservatives, or Republicans and Democrats, right, in the US, or California and now Florida. There's a dynamic thinking process that is different in those two areas. And it has really changed politics and it's shifted. So even though we have a multi party system, there is really no more chance, I believe personally, of conservatives of getting ever in power again because there's too many left leaning parties. And people keep voting them in because social programs, I need relief, I need more free dental, I need more free healthcare. I mean, even if these systems are completely broken, even if Canadians don't understand debt ratios to GDP, which is enormously high. If you look it up for Canada, we are probably the highest debt to GDP country now because the government and politics affect that. And our inflation has grown astronomically out of control compared to other Western G7 countries. All of this is because of politics, but politics are based on people. I can blame the prime minister, or I can really stop and say, what's been going on with the people of Canada? So, as we go through these series on Mondays, I'm going to talk about what's going on in Canada or the US or other politics and really break down, I think, past what's going on with those politicians to say what's going on with Canadians. What are the changes out there that have happened to cause us to go from a center right country to a far left? Basically, we are a borderlining socialist country. And there's no, you can't argue that we're not. We are. I mean, take a look at the news. Even the media that is corrupted gets to admit a lot of times. Like the government has no problems taking your freedoms away because we're here to protect people. And yet at the same time, they can't protect people. Crime's out of control. Immigration's out of control. We're at 8% unemployment in Alberta. And part of that is because of the stalling of the federal government. Part of that is the provincial government. A country or a province that used to have maybe 5.5% unemployment, and I don't think 8% is accurate. I think Alberta is probably roughly 9%. The rest of Canada is probably bordering on 11% unemployment. Realistic numbers. That means people that could work, not that don't want to work. So politics is like affecting everything. Canada, I don't know if you're listening from the US and you're seeing this and you're like, whoa, Canada's that bad? Yeah, it is that bad. I've thought about moving. The only reason I have not moved my family out of Canada, only one reason is I'm sorry, US, but your healthcare, although you could say it's better, is too expensive and it's not regulated properly. So I can't afford to break my leg and owe $70,000, right? Even with insurance. That part of your country is not good. The rest, not too bad. Like I agree with most of the United States and how it runs things in regards to less taxes, more freedom, et cetera, et cetera. But I do not like, I'm sorry, but objectively, your healthcare system is scary. It scares a lot of people that, you might say, well, how come so many people come there? Because they take the risk, hope they don't get sick. And they hope they can bank enough or get a good enough insurance to cover those things. But the risk versus rewards right now, like, isn't isn't an incentive to move to the United States. But is Canada, I think its health system depends on where you're at. Alberta is not so bad. Ontario was terrible, but I'll save that for a different rant. My rant was just giving you guys a basic Cole's notes of what's Canadian politics, like the basics. How does it function? Where is it going? We're going to discuss that. We're going to discuss that. Where is Canadian politics today? Where was it? Where is it going? All of that's important, and it's great to understand. But thanks for you guys joining me this week. I hope you've enjoyed this political rant, and I hope you've learned a little bit from Dave. Peace.